Okay, well, there may be people coming on in, but let's go ahead and get started and jump right in. So welcome everybody. It is great to see you all, and thank you for joining us for this edition of The Great Movies discussing Dawson City Frozen Time. We got a lot of new people tonight, which is wonderful. We're just so glad that you were able to join us. We're going to get into our discussion and introduce our special guest in just a moment. But before we do that, it's always a pleasure to have my partner in crime, Darnice, with us. Darnice, always great to have you. Thank you for joining us. And a special welcome again to anyone joining us for the first time. If you're new to our group, please know that we want as many people participating as possible. So if you have a question or a comment, please don't be shy. Darnice will be glad to work you in. We do ask that you please mute your microphone if you're not speaking. There's also a virtual raise your hand feature on Zoom, but you can just do it the old-fashioned way and raise your hand. That works just as well. Also, we are recording tonight's program, so if you want to disable your camera or rename yourself, you can do that now. Now, if you're not already on our email list and you would like to be, I will include my email address right now. You got it, Darnice?
Yeah.
Oh, very good. She's always ahead of me. So you can email me and I will put you on our list. And that is for anyone who would like to know what's coming up. That's where I make my announcements about upcoming programs and other news. And remember, you don't have to live in Maryland to enjoy our program. So I hope you will sign up. And don't forget that next time we'll be together is going to be on Friday, January the 8th, 2021 at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for a discussion of Aguirre, The Wrath of God from 1972, a film from German filmmaker Werner Herzog, a film that Roger Ebert placed in his all-time top 10. It's an astounding film, and I can't wait to discuss it with you. In fact, I'm going to put the link up to that program in the chat if Darnice doesn't beat me to it.
No, you got that one quicker than I
Okay,
can.
all right. So that is in the chat right now. So the way our programs work is the sign up is generally 2 weeks before the event. So you're going to have to wait a little while before you sign up for that. But that will also take you to our library events page where you can search for other movie events that we have or any events that the library has. All right, so last week I sent you the schedule for January and February 2021, and in a couple of days, I will have the March, April, and May schedule for you, which includes more special guests, and I think you're going to be excited about these programs. Yeah. So for the first part of tonight's program, what we would like to do is to have everyone muted. I'm going to ask our guest a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to everybody. But before we start, I would really like to thank all of you for your support for these virtual discussions. As many of you know, we did these in-person events at the library, and they were held once a month. And then when the pandemic started, we were discussing these movies virtually, and we were discussing a movie every week for 25 weeks in a row. We slowed that down in September, but you guys keep coming back, which is wonderful. We've had a lot of special guests, including tonight's, and we've had audiences from at least 26 different states and 2 Canadian provinces, and tonight, our first guest from Europe. So this is wonderful. And Darnice and I are still trying to make it better each time. So we both would like to say thank you for joining us. We plan to keep this thing going, so don't go anywhere, okay? All right. So do we have any questions at this point before we move forward?
I have a suggestion.
Sure.
Because there are a lot of boxes on the screen, and the first part of our program is going to be basically Andy and Bill speaking. It might be a good idea if you have the option to use speaker view, and that way you'll see the two of them alone and be able to see that as opposed to other faces. And then once we open up the questions, you can go back to gallery view, and then we can see everybody's hand.
Okay, very good, Darnice, thank you. And I promise not to hog up all the time with Bill. So the sooner I start that, the sooner it'll be time for everybody to ask questions. So,
and if you have questions as they're talking, you can put them in the chat, or jot them down yourself, and then we'll get to them after that. Okay?
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So a word or two about our guest before we bring him on officially. I first saw Dawson City Frozen Time when it was first released. I knew nothing about it except that it had to do with the discovery of several silent films. I knew nothing about Bill Morrison and decided after watching that film to purchase a box set of his films. And I was absolutely blown away. My first thought, maybe it was your first thought too, is nobody is making films like this. And my second thought was, I wonder if I could get him to join us for a discussion of Dawson City on the program. So he graciously accepted, and I can't wait to hear what Bill has to say about his film. Bill Morrison is an award-winning American filmmaker born in Chicago, currently living and working in New York. His 2002 film, Decasia, with music by Michael Gordon, was the first film of the 21st century to be selected by the Library of Congress for its National Film Registry. After viewing Decasia, the acclaimed documentary filmmaker Errol Morris stated, "This may be the greatest movie ever made." Several critics placed Dawson City Frozen Time not only on their best of the year lists, but also on their best of the decade lists. Morrison has also worked with some of the most important composers of our time, including John Adams, Philip Glass, the Kronos Quartet, Steve Reich, and many, many others. I am so pleased and honored to welcome Bill Morrison. Bill, thank you again for being with us tonight.
Oh, thank you, Andy. Thanks for having me. And what a great gathering of people that you've organized here. So congratulations to all of you for having this weekly get together. This is so great.
Well, thank you. Well, Bill, I want to ask you a couple of questions before we turn it over to the audience. I had told everybody that we were going to watch this film, and to give you a little bit of context, 2 weeks ago, we watched and discussed the silent film, The Last Laugh. And we've done a few silent films, but not that many. And I told them that, Dawson City is a very unique documentary. It almost seems a little unusual calling Dawson City a documentary. It's almost like it exists in its own category. Unlike most documentaries, it doesn't really have talking heads. It doesn't really have a Ken Burns style of narration, but it is like silent films with the text acting like title cards in a way. My first question is, how did you arrive at the format for this film?
Anyway, thank you for observing that it's not like other documentaries. I would say it does have a few talking heads in it, at least more than most of my films do. And it does, in fact, use the Ken Burns effect in that, the Ken Burns effect was inspired by a mid-century film which used the pan and scan for the first time, and that's noted in the film. And so, in some ways, I'm paying homage to what inspired Ken Burns. When I first heard of this collection being found in a swimming pool, I thought that it would be an interesting story to try to tell using what was found in the swimming pool, and then augmenting that with other archival footage as I went along, so that it would seem like this is sort of a story made up of the stuff that it's telling the story of, and in that way be somewhat self-reflexive, but also sort of that give you idea of what else is lost, even if it wasn't buried in the tundra, that it's lost in archives, or there's just a plethora of footage that's been shot since the beginning of cinema, and what haven't we seen? So it opens up the possibilities of all these clips that we haven't seen, including those that are lost, and those that are just lost to us, that we haven't seen, or that maybe they came from a different culture, or, a different language, or there's many ways that we've restricted ourselves from what we've been able to view, and we're not supposed to view everything. So the idea was, this is a story that's coming to you from this swimming pool. The structure is basically chronological. I mean, it starts with this very contemporary, for me anyway, very contemporary looking footage of a sports interview that I had with Chris Russo, and then it very quickly dives down, almost like an archaeological dig. It goes back to the late 1970s when the footage was found, and then goes even deeper into the formation of nitrate film and that film stock, and then going back up through Edison and the paper prints, and eventually arriving at the present day again. But it digs this trough, if you will, and then climbs back out of it. And every decade is represented by a different type of media, whether it's the old glass plate negatives of the photographs, or the paper print films from the Edison era, or the nitrate films that were actually found in the swimming pool, or the 16 millimeter amateur films, or City of Gold, the 35 millimeter film that inspired Ken Burns. Every decade is represented by a different type of media. So I thought that by showing all those, we'd also get this archaeological dig through the different layers of media that have come to make up our century.
Yeah, it's wonderful the way that it all came together. I wanted to ask you about your collaborator, Paul Gordon, I believe is the one who invited you to see the Dawson City films back in, was it 2013?
Yes.
And I saw an interview with you both where I believe you mentioned that you watched all of the newsreel footage that was discovered. Is that right?
Yeah, at this point, I've seen all the newsreels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And although you didn't watch all of the non-newsreel collection, you found an astounding number of images and scenes that perfectly match the story that you're telling on screen. And I think you mentioned also that it was kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of selection and some of the decisions that you made based on what you saw?
Yeah, I mean, this was a really unique story in that if you research it, and Paul really knew where a lot of the smoking guns, where a lot of the bodies were buried. When I got, just as some background, Paul Gordon works in digital migration at Library and Archives Canada. So he knows a lot about that collection, but he also programs for an independent cinema, not unlike what you guys do. And so he had invited me up to Ottawa to show Decasia, and he said, by the way, this is my day job here at the library. Why don't you come? And I said, well, you have Dawson City, right? And he said, right. So on the very first day, he showed me this letter that the bank manager had written. And it's very odd to ever have an archaeological dig where there's actually a typewritten letter saying this is what this is and this is why it's here. But that actually existed with Dawson City, which was already really jaw-dropping to me, because I wasn't sure how much of this was all mythology, but to see the typewritten letter, this is why this stuff was here, a complete fluke. So using that letter as sort of my shooting script, if you will, I took key phrases from that, whether it was swimming pool or gold or bank or library or film, and searched the database of what the collection was and tried to find occurrences of descriptions of actions that would sort of match that. And so, of course, I came up with everything that had to do with mining, or everything that had to do with film. And from there, just some of the titles that were evocative, End of the Rainbow or something like that. I just started pulling the narrative films that Girl from the North Country, things that seemed like they would apply to this story. Even though none of this, of course, was shot in Dawson City, let alone the Yukon. Most of it was shot in either New Jersey or California. There was the idea of the gold rush was a huge, formative fantasy of early filmmakers. So there was, in those days, not just the Western, but also the Northern. The idea of a trapper and a Mountie and a girl who runs the bar. And, there was a whole type of film that we've forgotten now that was about, mining towns in the North, So I wanted to try to connect the dots really from the formation of cinema through the silent era, through the early talkies, and to the 70s when these films and photographs were found.
I wanted to talk just a minute about your musical choices, or the choices that you and your musical collaborators make. Um, and the music in your films, often very modern music, is a very important component. Can you talk a little bit about some of the decisions that you make with your musical collaborators, Alex Summers in the case of Dawson City, and in particular, the connection between music and decay?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that, um, just to pick up on your last remark, that, you know, with decaying images, you have two levels, right? You have the photographed image, and then you have whatever's happening to the surface, and those are at two very different tempos. The image behind it is moving much slower, and the decay or any distress to the surface changes from every frame. So really, it's kind of annoying to look at it unless you slow it down, and then it becomes an image in of itself. And as all these silent films were under crank, meaning they were shot at 16 or 18 frames a second, um, slowing them down only brings them more into what we consider true viewing speed of 24 frames a second. And so that decay is slowing down as well, and that's becoming something that's still faster, but something that you can read as an image, and that in some ways, in the best of all scenarios, relates to that image. With Decasia, I really cherry picked moments where the decay and the image were relating to each other, or where the decay really got inside the image. With Dawson City, it's a different type of decay because it's water damage. That means it's basically a patina on top, or it's really an erosion of the emulsion, so that's letting the light in. It's not actually getting into the chemicals of the image, but it's scraping away something that's on the surface. And there's a bit of that reaction to that kind of encroaching decay in the last flourish montage at the end of Dawson City, that in some ways it's an homage to the earlier work. But you know, vis-a-vis the music, that sets up two different dynamics between the rhythm, often percussive, that's represented by the surface, and the thematic or slow moving melodies that are often represented by the image. And you know, every project has a different composer, and every composer I have a different relationship with, and every project begins in a different way. Some of them are music driven, meaning that they are films that were really assembled to be in support of a live premiere of a new composition, as was the case in Decasia. And with my work with Bill Frisell, we went out on the road and he tried out new music, and I took recordings of that tour and built a sound track with these recorded performances as sort of a scratch track, and then he and I could both work from the same thing. With Alex, I worked in a more traditional way, in that I cut a version of the film using a scratch track, albeit a scratch track that he had a hand in writing. Either it was temp tracks that he and his partner Yonzi from Sigur Rós had written specifically for this project, and they had also released a CD in 2009 called Rice Boy Sleeps. And there was something I thought very moving and interesting about the way their music interacted with these images. It was somewhat wistful and lonely, and it was sort of spoke to an ephemerality, and the idea that these sounds were all kind of melting into each other, and so and that they were largely based in Reykjavik. So I felt, at least in my mind, that it had this northern sound. And you know, by the time I had it cut, I asked Alex if he was still interested, and he said, "Look, I have this whole year devoted to this project, and there's no way I'm not going to do this." And so he really, you know, I wanted him to make something that would be to envelop the listener. It would sort of put you in almost in a trance. While there would be cues, it would largely be an unending piece of music or suite of music, so that you wouldn't have this experience of coming in and out of the music would just kind of wash over you the entire time. I don't know, he sent me a bunch of different tracks to begin. We'd never worked together, so we didn't really have a language to talk. And, you know, as I was forced to explain to him what I wanted, I was forced to verbalize really for the first time what the film was and what it meant to me and what it was supposed to communicate, so that he could find some sort of musical translation for that. And I remember at one point telling him, you know, this is the tragedy of capitalism. We need more cellos, you know. And off he went and got a bunch more cellos, you know. So.
Well, it worked well. And these guys know it. I am a former music teacher. My wife is a professional musician. And the first time I saw the film, the thing that it didn't really make me nervous, but I guess it added to some tension that, like you said, musically, it never resolves.
Mm.
And you know, we're used to listening to, you know, music that resolves, whether it's pop music on the radio or even a Beethoven symphony. There's resolutions throughout, but the Dawson City is just is a constant sustaining, and there are peaks and valleys, but you almost feel like you're holding your breath for the whole thing, which I guess is a good thing.
Yeah.
But
I
yeah,
think you're able to exhale at the end. There's sort of a
yeah.
That's an interesting point. I've never heard it said quite that way.
Yeah. Well, Bill, let me ask you one more question before we open it up to everybody. And I'm sure you've been faced with this, with maybe other people have asked you this question. In the digital age that we're in now, so many of us want our viewing experiences to be ultra high definition, pristine, flawless. Yet you look at images and footage that most people would dismiss either because of their decay or decomposition. So for people who have only seen Dawson City and not your other films, can you tell us how you got interested not only in film, but in the properties of older film, especially decay?
Yeah, I mean, in any decayed image of an old nitrate footage, I'm as interested in seeing a high resolution scan of that as anyone else, maybe more. What I find interesting is the tension between that pristine image and whatever decay is fighting it. You know, these early images were usually one generation removed from the camera negative. There was no inner negative back then, so any print that exists is like one generation removed from what passed before the lens. You know, the nitrate stock was somewhat brighter, clearer than the subsequent stock, so the whites were more luminous, and it held more silver content, so the blacks had more gradation and more richness. So there's really a spectacular visual quality in early film that has never been approached since, you know. So we can talk about 4K digital, and I'm right there. If I could have 8K, I would take it, you know. But what I really find compelling about this early stuff is that it holds information in a way that we haven't seen since, and that there in the same frame, we see how fragile that is as there's swaths of decay and chaos come in and invade it. I think, you know, I was trained as a painter, so I'm interested in the plastic arts and the materiality. So in any film, it tells a story from the time it was shot to the time that we're watching it. And in physical media, any sort of you know, decay or scratch or dust or solarization or whatever's happened from it just sitting on a shelf or being buried or being pulled up from the bottom of the ocean, that tells the story of what's happened to that reel in the ensuing decades from when it was shot to when we saw it. And each print, each reel has a different story to tell. And in some ways that's analogous to our experience as humans, right? We all age differently, you know, but we age because we pass through this earth one day at a time. And That's quite different than what digital media does. It either exists or it doesn't. It doesn't age over time and pick up little artifacts of the time that it's existed on this world. It lives in a completely different realm. So in some ways, analog media is more human. It's more, it speaks of our time on this planet, and therefore it lends itself to this metaphor that any reel of film could be a memory, or as it ages, on one hand it's consciousness, and as it ages, it's memory.
Well, Bill, I know other people have a lot of questions, and I want them to have their shot. So we're gonna open it up to the audience. And again, just raise your virtual hand, raise your real hand, put things in the chat, and Darnice will take care of you.
Okay, so first, Susan has a message in the chat. She wants to know who paid for the restoration of the film that was found.
Okay, so the original restoration was a joint collaboration between Library Archives Canada, which at the time was called the National Archives of Canada, and the Library of Congress. And I understand that the AFI, also American Film Institute, had a hand in it. But it was primarily a joint collaboration between the two government institutions, and all the Canadian content, or any of the reels of film that showed Canadian content, the originals went to Canada, and all the rest went to the Library of Congress. And a acetate or safety copy was made of the entire collection 2 times. And so each library, in addition to whatever original footage they got a complete copy of the entire collection.
That was actually going to be my question next, is if, they backed this up, because
Oh yeah,
Right.
I don't want to lose it again.
It's been backed up, and now, since 2014, it's all been, and largely at my prodding, it's all been put on as 4K scans too. So
Awesome.
Great.
So we got Sue, and then Walter has standing up. Yep. Go ahead, Sue.
Well, I want to say that I felt totally propelled through this picture, and this whole experience, and it was concise and part of a piece that made you look back and look today. But every time I had a question like, well, what happened in the Klondike, or what happened to the films, or, well, what was wrong with the nitrate? Every time the answer was coming to me as I was formulating the question. And when I stopped, I said, okay, now I've got to go research Robert Service. Now I've got to go look up Nanook of the North. Now I want to look up Haig.
Yeah.
I kept busy for hours.
Oh, good.
I mean, it was fabulously informative and stimulating, and I had to go watch it again. But I do have one. I just want to tell you, it was fabulous.
Thank you, Sue.
Great.
Yes,
so much.
and my one question is, what did the baseball discussion have to do with all the rest?
Yeah,
I just lost that.
Yeah, lost on people who aren't big fans of baseball, and that's many Americans, but many, many more people globally, I've found, were completely stupefied by the baseball discussion. But in our culture, the Black Sox Scandal is something like a holy grail of popular culture. And the fact that 5 minutes of this World Series, where the White Sox threw the games in order for mob payments, that could be discovered in 2014, and not just discovered, but that discovered on 35 millimeter film, and including some of the same plays that were used in court testimony. It spoke to the astounding breadth that this collection had. There's many other incredible finds in there, and some that I couldn't include in the film, but that was a really far-reaching one, and that's why I led off the film with it, because it took the baseball world absolutely by storm, and I had to really convince the baseball world that I was not making a movie about the Black Sox scandals of 1917 or 1919. But that was an important enough discovery that it got me on for instance, national television, and it became a way of leading into the film. And then if you think about just the chance involved there, you know, back then World Series were 9 games long as opposed to 7 games long now. And of course, not every game was represented on a newsreel, only certain plays of certain games were. So the chance that a newsreel photographer caught that play that was later used as testimony in court was incredible coincidence, and that made it into the edit before anybody knew that something was amiss was also a coincidence. And that newsreel made it in up to Dawson City, you know, and unlike most of the films that made it to Dawson City, it also made it into the storage in the library, and then it made it into the swimming pool. And, you know, if you think about it being in the swimming pool, there was also a nitrate fire on top of that swimming pool that raged, and it was preserved underneath in the permafrost. And then many hundreds were not recoverable, or they were left there, but it was one of the lucky 533 reels that made it out of there and then was able to be restored. And then it sat for 40 years, and nobody knew that there was another 5 minutes of the 1919 World Series until I came along. And being a White Sox fan, grew up in Chicago, that was one of the first things I searched for, was what White Sox footage is there. And so to me, it was also a divining rod. It was a way of plowing through the entire collection and all the incredible you know, fortuitous events that had to take place for us to be able to see that one play taking place in the first game of the 1919.
Well, thank you. I'm a White Sox fan and grew up in Chicago too, so thank you.
Oh, good. I thought that you would be grateful then. What are you asking me for?
Oh no, I was just trying to figure out. Now I get it. I mean, I got the point, but the first part where you started in baseball was where I wasn't quite linking. But yeah, no, that was fabulous. Absolutely fabulous.
I mean, I'm with you. It's hard that the thing that we're most famous for is that we cheated, you know, but.
Yeah, right.
We could get in a whole bunch of that. So to go to Walter's question, and then we have a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah, I'll take questions from Bulls fans too.
So thank you, Andy and Darnice, for organizing this, and thank you, Bill, for the film. I'm lucky to say I saw this in a movie theater a couple years ago.
Oh, great.
Wow.
So I totally remember the entrancing, mesmerizing atmosphere it conjures up in a small movie theater. And I'm calling from Windsor, Ontario tonight.
Okay.
So my question to you is, I saw this film the other night. It was also about Canadian history, but it was done in a completely different way. It was actually made up history. The film is called 20th Century, and it's about the 10th Prime Minister of Canada, William Lyon Mackenzie King. So that director, that person's approach was to just like take some of the memories of the diaries written by the prime minister, and then he kind of dreamed up some of what happened, and then he created a screenplay, and that was the result of his film. My question is, did you know going into creating this film, you knew that you were going to make it a very like historical fact, almost as if you're reading, you know, something from a microfiche 1904 newspaper, which I know that you know you have those in the film. And also, if you could talk a little bit about what was it like just editing it down, you know, all the stuff you had to the final result.
Yeah, thanks for your question. So that is a kind of genre now, the mockumentary or the hybrid documentary that also plays with fantasy elements, and it can lend itself to really interesting explorations. And I love a lot of films like that. And I don't know how many of you guys remember Forgotten Silver, but it was about a lost film collection in New Zealand that you know, or lost the lost oeuvre of a fictional director, but it was I'm forgetting the director's name, but you know, he did all the Lord of the Rings somebody help me out. Anyway,
Jackson,
Bearded guy. Thank you.
yeah,
Peter,
I
Peter
said
Jackson.
bearded guy.
Peter Jackson,
Peter-
and you know, he went and interviewed all, Leonard Maltin and Harvey Keitel, or people knowledgeable about film history, and created this mythology, and so that people thought it was real, that this had actually taken place and that this guy existed. Also in my short, The Film of Her, I tell the story of the Library of Congress's paper print collection, sort of a mini Dawson City that I did 20 years earlier, with the same sort of eye towards a fantasy element that tells a different part of the story, or explains an unexplained part of the story in a different way. With the Dawson City story, it was very important to me that I established that I was telling a true history, because for the very precisely the reason that it's such an incredible story. I mean, the gold rush itself is an incredible story, that all these people pulled 2,000 pounds each up over the Chilkoot Pass, and that all these, this tiny remote town all of a sudden had 40,000 people in it, and that this sort of lifting of Western civilization into a completely remote outpost was an astounding story. And what are the ramifications of that? And that also very coincidentally paralleled the discovery of film, or at least the first manifestations of film as a commercial device that could be a ticket could be sold for, and a group of people could watch the same thing in a room, as opposed to on a Nickelodeon or something like that. Those two events were intertwined, and so the idea that you could tell a history of cinema and a history of Dawson City, and that the two things could bounce against each other, was just incredible poetry. So I wanted to remove any idea that this was a fantasy, for the very reason that it was so fantastical, and so in that way, in the starting off with the news program is an announcement. This is a verifiable, or this is true, so so that was a different approach. It's a different approach than I had done in the past, and but I felt like the story had to be told, and it had to be told correctly. When I was researching for this film, I went to Dawson City in the September of 2014, and it was just when Ridley Scott had released his Yukon series, and everybody up there was very pissed off that Ridley had gotten so much of it wrong, and I was like, wow, if that guy's pissing people off because he got his history wrong, I'm gonna have to do a really good job of researching to please all these people, in particular the Gates. And they were just astounding historians, and I don't think they would have looked askance at some sort of poetic license being taken with the truth. So I think that was one part of your question. I remembered it. Was there another part? I'm sorry.
Yeah, the other part was I was just fascinated about all the material you had, right? And then you're sifting it down to 2 hours. So what was that like for you?
I don't know. Some people think they could have kept sifting, but at any rate, it was hard to let them go. There was, I think Andy mentioned in past interviews, I likened it to a jigsaw puzzle, and there were parts that I knew still I needed to find a piece for that I didn't have a piece for, and then there was, it's like a chain. Every image has to relate to the one before it and after it. And one of the great things about working chronologically is that things can resurface again, that somebody can appear as a child and then later on as an older person, or and in that way it gives a sort of narrative structure simply just by following the century through. But there was things that I had to leave on the drive, as we say now, and as opposed to on the cutting room floor, right? There was more history about Dawson City that I would have liked to have included, but it was just getting incredibly unwieldy. You know, I was certainly encouraged to take the baseball sequence out, but I just couldn't do it. To me, it tied to the labor issues, and it tied to, as I was saying, the incredible coincidence of the footage and what else could have been lost if this most famous story could have been lost. But there was also, you know, I had certain I guess rules, and that was that any image had to, anything I wanted to talk about had to have a piece of image with it that related to it, and it had to relate to something else in the film, and it had to reappear. So the things that had, you know, a team of other images that it related to, and that it could recur later on in the film, got precedent over something that was just an isolated story and was going to drop out, you know.
Awesome. Thank you. So we'll go to Chuck, and then I'll read a few comments and questions from the chat.
Yeah, well, Bill, I really enjoyed the film, and I just wanted to, my question was, how has it had any impact on the city itself since they found the films of Dawson City? Has they become more interested in like silent film or film preservation in general?
I wouldn't say that the city itself is interested in film preservation. I mean, none of the films actually live there anymore. You know, they've all been moved to Ottawa or to Culpeper, Virginia. And the story is somewhat known there. I wouldn't say it's, you know, it's known by the locals. It's sort of a fun fact if you're a tourist. You might catch wind of it if you go to the library. But they certainly, you don't see any reference to it around town. It is an incredible place, and I urge any of you guys who have any interest in traveling to the Canadian far north to go, because thank God it's in Canada, because they haven't screwed it up. You know, the streets are still unpaved. You know, there's no McDonald's there. It's all mom and pop shops. And there's also a rule that none of the landmark buildings can be torn down until they fall down on their own. So there's just these astounding structures that are all leaning on each other, and you know, it's just incredibly haunted town, and a lot of fun. You know, the people go there to party basically, but it's a wonderful place to visit in the summer. I've never been in the winter. I don't know if it's a wonderful place to visit in the winter.
That's awesome. So you mentioned going up there. Oren had a few questions. He did actually say that he and his wife really enjoyed going there a few years ago. But let's get to some of these questions, because we got quite a few, and they're pretty good. First off, were there any films in a complete or relatively complete status? Will we see some coming out from Kino? Matthew asked.
Oh, okay. So no, there were no complete films. And in some ways, you know, you have to remember this discovery was made over 40 years ago and was basically forgotten about. You know, I mean, I knew about it because this is something people used to talk about in the 80s. There was a couple articles about it, but even in the film symposiums, it was sort of like, oh yeah, that was a weird thing that happened. Because there was no complete real restorations, I think many archivists considered it a bust. You know, I know Sam Kula flew out there the next day because he thought he was going to find Theta Bara in Cleopatra, which is sort of the, you know, that's the big Rosetta Stone or whatever. You know, that's the holy grail of lost films. You know, and who knows if it even was a very good film, but for whatever reason, that's caught in everyone's consciousness. If we could just find Theta Bara and Cleopatra, and because these were all piecemeal, you know, at most you'd find 3 reels from the same picture, but you know, mostly it'd be a single reel or 2. They filled in the blanks in some cases where other reels existed elsewhere and they were missing a certain reel, and so that was very interesting. But I mean, this week we had the announcement of the Library of Congress National Film Registry and Bread, which was released in 1918 and played in Dawson City in 1920, and only reels 3 and 4 were discovered there, but yet because of reels 3 and 4, that film has now been included on the National Film Registry. We don't have a complete version of it, so I think people are more and more starting to see that we're grateful for what we have, even if they're not complete pictures. But I do think that that's an attitude that's changed over time, and that because there wasn't a complete picture and because there was this annoying white lines coming from the side that that was, you know, disparagingly labeled the Dawson Flutter, that archivists kind of rolled their eyes at the Dawson City collection as kind of this muddy, ugly step sibling that had emerged and was demanding shelf space.
Interesting. Well, that kind of connects to a question that Bill had and wanted to know if there were any classic films that were thought to be lost that were found in this collection.
Well, you know, I wouldn't say they were classic films. There was nothing that was considered like great cinema, and I think, you know, for the most part, the theater programmers up there were getting sort of the cheap stuff that you know didn't cost as much, you know, that was you know, on the second run, and so this would have been the bargain discount cinema, and of course they knew they had a full house no matter what they put up there, so you really don't find anything like that. But I mean, there are great directors that are represented, and, you know, a few great actors, and so we're lucky to have what we do.
So a couple other questions that I'm compiling together. Were the scenes, all the scenes that were in the movie, of the movie audiences or other things, were they all Dawson City reels?
Yes, they were all,
Yeah.
they were all, you know, scenes from the film.
Scenes from films
yeah,
of
yeah.
that were. Right.
Anytime there was a white title, that said Dawson Film Find or Dawson City Film Find, that designated that film was found in the collection. And then in other cases where there isn't that designation, you're to assume that it came from elsewhere. But all those shots of the audience looking at the screen happen to come from the Dawson collection.
Awesome, great. So let's see, what's the next question here? We've got a couple of just comments about, you know, the film itself, that the baseball part really seemed to provide historical context. And back to Oren's comment, I forgot where he said, but they actually rode the Yukon and White Pass Railway from Skagway. So that's a little connection there.
Nice, yeah.
And it was really interesting to hear about all the fortunes made in the Yukon, which still affect us. I was also surprised at a number of the names that connected to, you know, Hollywood, you know, history. It's quite interesting.
And political history.
And political history, yeah, and brothels. Who knew? We won't get into that.
But we're not surprised either, or I'm not either.
Oren said that you mentioned Bill Frisell. Was he any relation to Lefty Frisell?
No, that's spelled differently.
Okay, spelled differently. All right. And that we, for years, he maintained that the only folks who made money in the gold rush were those who sold picks and shovels to the prospectors. And it seemed like this notion was confirmed in the film.
Yeah, I think that, well, you have the Mine the Miners was the.
Yes,
you know,
yeah, exactly.
And that's what Dawson City was. The mines weren't actually in Dawson City. That's where you went to get entertainment or to replenish your supplies. And then the mines were, you know, 20, 25 miles out of town. So that was quite a schlep, you know.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got a couple more. Wally wants to know, is there any merit in trying to get computers to restore the damaged footage as much as possible? Because software is getting better now, and figuring out missing pieces and parts of the scene, or should the damage find just be left alone?
Well, in my opinion, it's better left alone, but maybe not everyone shares my aesthetic. I find there's great beauty in seeing that just decay, and it reminds us of that these are a series of pictures that have passed through a projector and have passed through the world and are now hitting us one picture at a time. And I just find that remarkable and very emotional. And so that I wouldn't want to see this stuff restored, but other people might.
Best guess, how many times did things burn down in Dawson because of these nitrate films?
There's that one line that the business district burned down every year for the first 9 years of, and
Yeah.
that always gets a laugh when you're in a theater, but you have to figure that the nature of building on tundra is that if you build a structure and then heat it, your foundation starts to melt. And so you can't really use brick or concrete or anything. You have to use wood. So it was always this wood foundation. And of course, you were heating with fire. You had at times a lot of crazy people in town, so you add these things together, alcohol, nitrate film, there's going to be some fires. Two of those fires from the first 9 years were caused by the same gal, I understand. I don't know if that's true or not, but as
So
the
not
legend
George
goes.
Black, because Wale pointed out that some of the comments in Canopy, he said, he seemed to have a lot of home movie footage of these Dawson fires.
Okay,
Maybe
well,
he had something to do with it.
George, that I've heard that theory as well. George Black was the first prime minister from the Yukon. First, he was a Yukon. He came in as a stampeder and became first a premier of the Yukon as that territory was being established, and later a prime minister. And he left in a nervous breakdown, and his wife Martha Black took over for him. So he understood the significance of these buildings burning. He was seeing the history of Dawson City go up in flames, and so he was a amateur photographer and cinematographer. He shot a lot of caribou, I can tell you that. I could do a whole 2-hour feature on George Black's caribou, but I thought it was amazing that he had shot the Orpheum in flames, as well as the D3A in flames, and that he was there and that he had the wherewithal, that he had the camera and the film and didn't freak out and shot it was pretty amazing. But you're right. The Orpheum, I believe, was caused by arson. I'd be very surprised if George Black was behind that.
A little suspect. So Jason wants to know, of all the films you found in the permafrost, is there one that stands out as a favorite for you, or one that you felt worked best for constructing your film?
Well, the final shot of that woman who's gesticulating madly and the decay is coming in. She's actually a dancer who's pantomiming, as they say in the card, for suffragist rights. So it was a dance piece that was meant to illustrate the suffering of woman's right, hadn't been granted the right to vote yet. It's an extraordinary 1:40 seconds. I never could cut it. It just was this gem on its own, and it kept going. So at one point I realized that was my out film, that was the final shot of my piece. So it really rose to the top as the most powerful shot I had. So I would always have to say that one. But, just about every shot in there, I have some sort of deep personal relationship with at this point. Seeing Bread get named to the National Film Registry was like seeing one of my babies make it. It's like to see, I lived with that shot. And so I've been really lucky to get to know the collection well, and even since finishing the film, have ordered more and more of that footage to look at and peruse for different news stories. You know, I just finished a short film using the collection this year that was all these race riots, you know, how race riots were reported in the news back then. And there was 3 different episodes, and then also that extraordinary footage of the silent march that I also included in the film. So hopefully there'll be a new life for that short, you know.
Yeah, that kind of ties into our next question, because we had a couple of people ask what you're working on now, or what's your next film.
So yeah, I mean, in addition to that short, I finished a feature film that's not unrelated. I used the same font, for instance, but a little bit bigger this time.
We won't watch it on Canopy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But just as I was finishing this film up, I got an email from the late Icelandic composer Jóhann Jóhannsson, who I worked with on a film called The Miner's Hymns. And he had been visiting his home in Iceland for the summer, and a story had come on the news about how an Icelandic fisherman had pulled up his net, and in his net of fish that had been scraping the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, and should be noted the middle of the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, because Iceland forms at that crevice between the European continent and the North American continent, were reels of a Soviet film, not a terribly old film, a film from 1969, a film that most Russian people would be familiar with. The star of it was an enormous Russian star named Mikhail Zharov. And the film was called the Derevensky Detektiv in Russian, or the Village Detective. And so I've taken 4 reels that rested at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean and restored them. And then I've gone back into the filmography of that star, Mikhail Zharov, who, you know, began working in films in 1915. So before there was a revolution, you know, when under Tsarist Russia, he was making films as a boy and as an extra. And then he really moves through the silent era as sort of a bit player, but when sound comes, he becomes a big star because he's very charismatic and he can sing, and he can do different accents, and he ends up, you know, making 70 films and being in, you know, at least 150 theatrical productions in the most highly esteemed theaters of Russia during, you know, a real golden era of theater. So he was an extremely important person to the Soviet Russian arts community, someone none of us would have heard of, you know, no one in the West would have heard of, unless you were a scholar of Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible, because he had a significant role in that film. And if you knew that film really well and knew all the cast members, then you would know who he was from that. But virtually everything else would have been only if you were a Russian of a certain age. So it goes back to this story of blind spots of entire filmographies or film histories being lost, or just sitting in an archive somewhere unknowns to us or unknowable to us because of whatever our predisposition is to it.
Awesome. So we're talking about, Jan has a question about your other film. Bill, I'll get to you in a minute too, Bill. Talking about The Great Flood, said it was a powerful film because he was born in Mississippi and lived there for 50 years. So how did you get the idea of using the Sears Roebuck catalog? And did you immediately see the power of using those images?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I imagine not everyone here has seen that film, but it's on the ICRAS. I think you can see it on ovid.tv. It's part of ICRAS's collection. At any rate, the 1927 flood, just as a brief background, was an enormous Mississippi River flood that displaced 1 million people in 1927, many of them sharecroppers, and is always cited as a significant chapter in the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North. Certainly something that began in Reconstruction and continued well into the Second World War, and indeed today. But this particular chapter, the 1927 was one that I thought had a lot of parallel to the time when I made it. I was first made aware of that footage, this extraordinary newsreel footage that was shot at the time, when I was looking at, I was looking for aerial footages of floods and noticing that they were all in 1927, and I used it in a different project. But that same year, Katrina happened, and all that footage started to look very contemporary, and people started to cite the 1927 flood and what had happened down there with dynamiting levees, and comparing that to the failures of the Army Corps of Engineers in New Orleans. And so there was a history there that I wanted to explore more. I ended up reading John Barry's book, Rising Tides, and from that started to construct a history using the footage that I could find of the 27 flood. The idea to use the Sears Roebuck catalog, well, back then, the Sears Roebuck catalog had a circulation that basically approximated the entire, it's like, I don't know, a third of the people there was 75 million Sears Roebuck catalogs in circulation, and maybe 300 million people in the country or something. Like, it was just an extraordinary proportion. And you often hear these anecdotes that people had two books in their house, the Bible and the Sears Roebuck catalog, or maybe they had the Montgomery Ward catalog as well. And that children would often make stories up using the illustrations. There's it was mentioned, it was, I think, The Warmth of Other Suns, it was mentioned in that, along these lines. And so I started to understand the Sears Roebuck catalog as a picture book of things that people wanted, this aspiration towards a better life that maybe could be had in the North, but also all the stuff that you could order and that could be contained in your house, and then therefore could be washed away, everything we lost. So it's sort of a chronicle of materiality, of commercialism, and also this idea that it could be a dream book, and that because of its layout that is consistent, if you just showed page after page, a sort of animation would happen, which occurred. And so, Bill Frisell is a dear friend of mine and an important composer. And as we were building this piece, I really was attracted to all the dirges and, these ballads and things like that. And he kept sort of injecting something that was light and up and almost comical. And, I liken it to the music of Thelonious Monk and some of this playfulness. And he said, you need to have this, or else the other stuff won't resonate. So I was looking for something that would also could animate that, those sequences. And so using the Sears catalog also fulfilled that role too.
Awesome. Cool.
Well, we've gone over a little bit over an hour, but Darnice, were there still a couple other questions? Okay, if Bill, if you've got time.
You got a minute?
Yeah.
Just some comments, mostly since you were talking about it too, about the music. Debbie thought that it blended eloquently with the imagery, and was also happy to see a mention of Alice Guy Blache. I don't know if that's the way.
Oh, yeah.
Blache. Yeah. And there was one other comment. Oh, so you had mentioned Culpeper, and Oren had asked what was in Culpeper, and I'd mentioned that was the Packard campus.
Yeah.
And Matthew talked about actually going to see the film vault in Culpeper.
Yeah.
And they're stored in refrigerated vaults on cement shelves with water pipes over them, with a continuous waterfall, so that they can't ignite, which clearly we've seen that it only takes probably a magnifying glass with the sunlight that can make them explode. So that was good. But I haven't seen other questions. Let me just check, see.
Just a note on Culpeper.
Yeah. Oh,
just a
and
note
you
on.
went there, right?
Library of Congress. Yeah, I go there regularly, at least once a year. I didn't get there this year. But those are my friends, and you know, they put aside things that they're going to throw out that they think I would be the only person in the world interested in seeing or saving. You know, they've never had a
Nice to
nitrate
have
fire
friends.
in the history of the Library of Congress. So the National Archives have had it, the Fox has had it, a bunch have had it. Library of Congress has, knock on wood, been very lucky. But there's also a
Yes,
great
very good.
misconception about nitrate, and that's that if you look at it cross-eyed, it's going to explode. That's not true. If you store it properly, it's going to last a lot longer than almost anything else. It just needs, it can't build up. You know, the gas can't build up in a enclosed. So you need to have ventilation. You need to have low temperatures and low humidity, and then you're pretty safe. You know.
Bill, did you have a question?
Is there another Bill?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I'm really enjoying this. I'm so glad that you're with us, Bill. Just a couple of quick comments as sort of a general question. I really enjoyed your earlier mention of sort of the juxtaposition of these really pristine, like what you're talking about, the nitrate,
Yeah.
and how illuminating it is, and
Yeah.
how it just, if you get a really nice print of it, it's so, the clarity of it for the time is so kind of amazing. And that juxtaposed with, as you were talking about the surface that was decaying, and that it's almost a whole other statement artistically on what's going on. It really makes me want to see Decaysian now.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Hearing about it. Also, what you and Andy alluded to earlier about the soundscaping of it, and the fact that you're using those interstill titles like you would in a silent film, it gives it a very ephemeral, dreamlike quality that is kind of hard to describe, and it just amazing. But I guess my general question is that it's obvious going in that you had this idea of sort of the chronological history of Dawson City and its boom bust aspects as a gold rush town, and also how the movies kind of evolved, and juxtaposing those two things together. But you've got so many other elements which are kind of disparate, but also kind of not. All of the union busting stuff, and the labor stuff, and the politics, and the capitalism, and the whole thing with Kennesaw Landis and how that crossed over to him becoming the commissioner of baseball. I'm wondering, it's like, how much of this, I know you'd alluded to the fact that you were always very careful to make sure that you had shots of the found footage that would illustrate anything where you were going. But how much of it was like you started out with those two things, and then you go, oh, well, I've got this, I've got this, I've got this. And the fact that you were able to keep it as unified as it was kind of astounding. So how much of that did you map out kind of early, and how much of it came to you as you were in the editing process?
Oh, it was all done in the edit. You know, I didn't have anything really mapped out. I started at the beginning and started to make stuff, and I made folders, and really things that rhymed with each other, you know, whether it was people listening at a door, or whether it was baseball, or if it was race relations, or, you know, sexual harassment, or whatever it was. You know, there was different folders that found their way because they related to each other, either topically or formally or something like that. You know, I had a couple different ways of trying to show the footage, and one was to think of it as, you know, the reason why this stuff was buried is because it was silent. So that a big part of it is that the talkies made this stuff commercially unviable. So I wanted it to behave like a silent film, and I wanted it to be surprising when you heard voices again, that you'd been left for quite a bit of time with just music and your own reading voice inside. You know, a lot of people have asked why there wasn't a narrator, but I really wanted it to be somewhat silent or meditative or internal in that way. And also that, you know, the way a silent film or early film program was designed was that there was the feature, but before that there was a newsreel and a short. So, you know, there's a whole newsreel sequence, and then there's the whole short sequence, and then there is a feature sequence, or in these narrative sequences that begins with the Alice Guy Blaché theater burning down. So, you know, there was different ways I was trying to marshal this footage together, and using different patterns and structures that would somehow adhere. But it was a big juggling match. It was like things had to go out, things had to come back in. You know, yeah, that Kennesaw Mountain Landis, he did double duty there, pulling together labor and the Black Sox thing.
Thanks.
Well, Bill, I think we could probably go all night, but we don't want to keep you up all night. So we're going to wrap it up here pretty quickly. This is the part of the program where I normally will make recommendations to everybody here of other films they could check out. So, but the problem is I don't know of anything else like this film except your other films, which I haven't seen all of them, but I've seen several. And Decasia is absolutely fascinating. We're working on getting Bill's collected works on DVD in the library system. So hopefully we'll have that soon for you to check out. Also know that on Canopy, there's lots of great silent films. Sue mentioned Nanook of the North, which if you've never seen, that's a must see. There's also Man with a Movie Camera, which we showed at the library 2 or 3 years ago. And really, you could just go to Canopy and hit browse, click movies, and click early film. There are just so many great films on there. But Bill, I thought
if I could make a couple recommendations.
I was going to ask you for some. Sure.
Yeah. Well, just that I'm thinking of films that have been programmed with my film in the past that I thought were effective. One was Guy Madden's My Winnipeg.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if these are on Canopy or not, but a wonderful and this is somebody who takes some historical fact and a heavy dose of fantasy and mashes them up to great comic effect. I really think the guy's brilliant, and I loved how My Winnipeg played with Dawson City. And another one, which was a great inspiration for this film, was Tom Anderson's Los Angeles Plays Itself, which is a telling of the history of Los Angeles using how that film has been represented in Hollywood movies. It's just a stunning essay. So I would really recommend that one as well. And that was, again, a big inspiration for this.
I'm putting that in the chat. I'm almost positive we have My Winnipeg in the library, and I love that film. And it's also the last appearance of Ann Savage, which we talked about in when we talked about Detour several weeks ago. And Los Angeles Plays Itself, I think, is on Canopy, and if it's not, I will see if we can get that in the library system. So.
And it would be great to get either of those guys to appear in a format like this, Tom Anderson or Guy Madden.
Yeah.
Guy Madden, you know, he noticed early on that if you do a lot of interviews, you end up saying the same thing over and over again. So he decided that the way to confront that was just to say something different, whether it was true or not. So he always gives a great interview, but he's something of a wild card.
Yeah, you have to fact check everything. Well, Bill, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been a real treat. And before you go, please tell us where we can find you online.
Oh, I do have a website. If people still go to websites, billmorrisonfilm.com. On Twitter, I post as Decasia. And I'm on Facebook as well. And I often post new stuff about what I'm up to on social media. So on Instagram, I have a new account called The Village Detective, which is about that new film of the Russian film found in the net. And I've got, I don't know, dozen stills uploaded there, and we'll be releasing information about when you can see that next.
Great. Well, again, Bill, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you, Andy. It was really fun.
Thank you so much.
You guys got a great community, so congratulations.
Well, thank you. Maybe you can join us again.
All right.
definitely.
And again, for everybody, for our next movie is going to be, again, Aguirre, The Wrath of God. That's on January the 8th at 7 p.m. Hope you can join us. And if I don't see you again for a while, everybody have a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and please take care and be safe. Thanks again for joining us.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. If you
Good
need
night.
Andy's email
Thank
address, it's
you.
in the chat. And we appreciate you, and everybody have a great new year. I mean,
Have a great holiday and
2020
great New Year.
is a good time for all of us.
Yeah.
And Los Angeles Plays itself is on Canopy.
Oh, excellent.
Good.
Yeah.
Very good.
That's a good one.
Very
And
good.
All
for
right,
all of
take-
those who had some issues with Canopy, we're going to investigate that next week and try to see what we can find out. It seems like it might be local to us because people who said they didn't have any problems were in other states or other
We're in other
provinces.
states.
So,
Okay, so it's probably a Maryland problem.
Yeah,
So,
it might be a
yeah.
Maryland
We
problem.
will take a look at that for sure. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you guys for letting
Good
us know
night,
about
guys.
that. Good
Yeah,
night,
good
everybody. Thanks again.
Happy
Bye-bye.
holidays.
Happy
Bye-bye.
holidays.
Happy
Happy
holidays.
holidays. Merry Christmas.
All right, bye, Dan.
Bye-bye.